Danan Margason is the Chief Product Officer of Carbon Direct, a consultancy and fund that focuses on solutions for end-to-end carbon management. But what the hell does that mean? Well, they help businesses track and reduce their carbon emissions. And they've done this for some companies you may have heard of: Microsoft, BlackRock, and Shopify.
Real quick, back to Danan. Before Carbon Direct, he was the director of product at Booking.com, an SVP at a local Northwest startup called Tune, and in past lives was an attorney and a professional rower. Super interesting guy.
And a cool cat. Now, this episode is particularly valuable for anyone who's been scratching their head on what exactly are carbon credits, are they BS, and what real carbon capture projects are happening.
Totally true, Jacob. I also think this is a super amazing episode for companies, startups, young, old, doesn't matter, that are thinking about their environmental impact and what they can do about it. We talk a lot about that, and you might find out that Carbon Direct is the answer for you. So stay tuned, check it out, see what you can learn yourself. I think it'll be valuable for you. And mayhem on, Jacob.
Mayhem on, man. Danan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're honored to have you. You're the first decarbonization, carbon management, sequestration company we're having on the show. I thought it'd be really important to get this angle. I thought we'd start off with something completely unrelated. What do you love about Bob Dylan?
How did you find this stat? Jacob found some stat that I've listened to Bob Dylan 10 times more than any other artist, which I think is actually true. That might even be a low number, but where did that come from?
Yeah, I found your Spotify. No, I just I was on Twitter. On your Twitter, I went maybe 2 years back or something. You had a random, it was a comment on someone else's tweet, something about Bob Dylan, and I just was like, okay, good, I got something.
Well, that's amazing. Good research. Yeah, I mean, Bob Dylan is a fascinating character, kind of a real person, but also an actor, hard to figure out. I love that about him. I love that he's both a poet and a genuine artist, cares about his craft. Very counterculture, which I'm probably not as much as I like to think I am, but I grew up in a hippie household and like to feel like I have some Bob Dylan in me. Nice. And I just love his music. He's, for whatever reason, it's resonated with me. I listened to it as a kid growing up quite a lot. And the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan album is by far my most listened to album, honestly, maybe by 50 or 100x. It's that album that I pick up anytime I'm kind of in a funk or in a weird mood and I just want to relax. So glass of whiskey, Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, that's the solution to everything in life.
Nice.
Bob Dylan's been making music. He made a lot of music, right? Was that, would you say, younger Bob Dylan, middle?
I think that was his second or third album. If I'm not mistaken. So yeah, before he went electric.
Okay.
I like it all, but that one, for whatever reason, just really sings to me.
And did your parents listen to Bob Dylan?
They did. If I recall correctly, they got married to Forever Young, Bob Dylan song. But yeah, I think I got exposed to it as a kid and just fell in love with it more in university.
Nice. Very cool. What you mentioned, you grew up in a hippie household. What was that like?
Well, my mom was really into recycling before it was cool. I think before we started, Ty was saying he's among that crowd. She actually developed the King County solid waste program. So King County was one of the first places to do curbside recycling, and she was part of the team that brought that to life. So environment was part of my life pretty early on. And I never heard the full story of my first name, but the tidbits I've heard sound like there were probably some drugs involved and other good times coming up with the name Danan. So
nice.
Yeah. But they were just very into environment, into health, the household with no sugar. So I was always going to friends to eat whatever the sugar cereal was I was into at the time. So yeah, that
no sugar. Gosh, that sounds intense. Kind of like it though. You mentioned Bob Dylan pushes the envelope. Do you feel like you try to push the envelope? You try to embody that in your career?
I think I'm very opposed to going with the grain
Mm.
in all respects, and that can be a blessing and a curse for sure. But I started my career. Well, I was a rower to the extent you can be a professional rower. That's what I did.
Wow.
And then when I got injured, I went to law school without any real training, without studying a whole lot for the LSAT, just because it seemed like something really different and interesting. And then hated being a lawyer. Went into tech, doing marketing stuff. Didn't like that. Wanted to get out of the country. Moved to Amsterdam and led product at Booking.com, which is a big travel company, before getting into climate. So I'm sure we'll get into some of that. But all those career things were about just shaking it up and trying to switch and do things differently. And it's not a criticism at all, but when I think about a lot of my friends from high school, university, law school, you see what they're doing. It's fairly predictable, I think, and I hope what I've done is kind of a weird path, and I like that it's weird, and I think I've learned and grown a lot by making it weird.
Nice.
So that's just in the career sense, but yeah, in general, I like to think that way.
Ty, I think you and
Nice.
Danan share that in common
Yeah, absolutely.
for
I'm
sure.
right there with you, man.
Right?
Love the adventure. Love the
Yeah.
adventure.
Ty, we don't usually go there, but how do you identify with that?
I took a very unique path as well. I
Hmm.
mean, I honestly didn't even think I would end up where I ended up today. But yeah, I went from trying to be just a philosopher poet a long time ago and anti-establishment, not have anything to do with big business, to being kind of obsessed with entrepreneurs and startups,
Hmm.
and getting into the tech startup world here in Seattle, over a period of 20 years. So, but I've changed careers multiple times and changed directions and always tried to go a little bit to the left of center if you can. So, yeah.
Yeah, you've had a pretty cool career. I'm too. I feel like I'm too green yet to state I've had an interesting career. Danon, so you mentioned rowing. You used to be a pro rower. What translates from rowing, and that could be culturally, principles, operating model, habits to business, since that's what you've been in for a while now.
Yeah, pro rower is a strong word. Barely covered the cost of my food, but yeah, to the extent you can be, I guess did that for a little bit. Um, yeah, so many lessons from rowing, and people who work with me get annoyed by all the analogs that I do. I think for me, the biggest takeaway from rowing was it's one of the few things where pure hard work gets results, and the people who are very
Mm,
successful and end up on national teams in the Olympics for rowing are not always, and in fact, I would say rarely, are the most talented. It's the people who
mm,
just stay at it the longest. And I think there's a lot of lessons there in life, and especially in climate. The teamwork aspect is
interesting.
also super interesting, where you have got there's different classes of boats, but the main one that you do in high school and university is an 8-person shell with a coxswain. And when you have 8 people, all different body types, all different styles, trying to get them to be completely uniform and in sync and get their blades to drop at the same time, come out at the same time, it's actually really
Wow.
freaking hard. So the
Yeah.
amount of intensity that you bring to each stroke, the amount of thought that you give to all of your teammates' habits and behaviors and trying to convince them to come along with you. I think a lot of that attention to detail and also just the teamwork element and the motivation element
Mm,
relates pretty closely to business,
Hmm.
and a lot harder to do in life. But I like thinking about those things.
Seems like you have to be intensely in the present, or making yourself be in the present if it's a competition with another team, right? And getting in sync with everyone. That seems pretty key, right?
It's super meditative in a way, but also
Mm-hmm.
very, very intense.
Hmm.
sure.
And I think because it is so intense in what you are doing in your own boat, and it's actually really hard. Like when you watch rowing,
Mm,
it looks easy. It's very, very hard to do that well. Because of that, even when you're racing, you don't think about your competition really at all. You can't afford to do that. You have to be focused on getting your boat to move as fast as possible. That's a really important lesson for
mm,
business. At least it has been for me.
Being intensely focused on
nice.
the goal, the objective, and not so much focus on the
Setting your
competition.
goal
Yeah.
and just making your boat go as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
competition will do what the competition does. But you're not always going to win every
Nice.
race. But if you can optimize yourself, you're going to end up in a good spot.
Nice.
That reminds me of Alpinist. That one documentary came out,
I saw
Marc-Andre
that.
Leclerc,
Yeah.
right? And when you're watching Ty, did you get a chance to see that film?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, those moments when they're filming him and he's just in the moment of doing the multi-faceted climbing, you're like, man, this guy has to be so present to be able to
Mm-hmm.
just reach that objective of getting to the top of it, right? And he's not looking, and that's why he doesn't want to look at the camera or doesn't want to have the camera there, because then to him it's distracting from him actually doing the thing, right?
There's this is a total tangent, but since you brought it up, probably the coolest clip of video that I've seen. Alex Honnold climbing Half Dome at Yosemite. It's before that movie came out about him. So he was famous in the climbing community, but not globally famous the way he is now. And it's just a YouTube video of him climbing Half Dome, and he ends up on this ledge, and free soloing as well. He ends up on this ledge and he starts to panic, and he's halfway up the wall, or 800 feet up or whatever. He starts to panic, and so you're watching this happen, and it's clearly a moment for him, and you can imagine the intensity of standing there. There's no way out. And at some moment he clicks, and he gets that focus back, that intensity, and he just looks up and starts going, and it almost shakes you to the core to see him go through that. Super cool.
Dang.
Yeah, anyway,
I gotta see that. I gotta see it. We'll link in the show notes if I'm able to find it. Danan, what got you interested in climate sustainability? Because you didn't work in climate before Booking.com, and when you worked at Tune, when did you start thinking about all these issues?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that there was any moment, and it's unfair because I actually ask people this in interviews sometimes. What was your climate awakening? Everybody kind of points to something, and I'm sure if I was being interviewed, I could come up with one answer. But it's really just amalgamation of things. Like I said, my mom was involved in the environment, so I was always pretty aware. At that point, environment was very different. You had acid rain was a little bit before my time, but it was that kind of stuff, and recycling, water pollution, air pollution. But climate change wasn't on anybody's radar when I was growing up, at least as a young kid. I was born in '84, and then as I got older, probably ignored it a bit. Got focused on my own things, didn't like litter, that type of environmentalist. I think the real sea change for me in thinking about climate change as a very serious issue was only 5 or 6 years ago, maybe, in Seattle, when we had smoke over the city. It's the first time, I spent my whole childhood here and never saw smoke. I think I saw it once when I was driving the east side of the mountains, over where most of those fires start. And seeing it kind of over Seattle, over Green Lake, where I rode in high school, I remember that quite vividly. And then, that started to happen every year. This year we didn't have it as much, but it's still, we saw it in September, October. So that sort of shocked me. And then I moved to Amsterdam in, I guess it was 2018, maybe early 2019. And people there care a lot about climate. So I think it's about 60% of the Netherlands is under sea level. It's all, there's basically levees around the entire country keeping the sea away. And so 2 feet, 3 feet of sea level rise is a very material impact on their lives. And Amsterdam, wouldn't exist if they hadn't engineered their ways out of it. So they're pretty attuned to it, talked about it a lot, and it's just started to think about it more and more. There's some really motivated and inspiring people at Booking.com who I worked with on my team, who are trying to implement better design choices into our software to make people travel shorter distances and go to hotels that have made smarter choices in terms of how they built the hotel and also the products that were used there. So it just was kind of on my mind more and more. But I wouldn't say I was an activist or super passionate about it until I found Carbon Direct.
Interesting. Nice. Yeah. I think I identify with that too. It's an amalgamation of things that add up, and it's almost like the pebble in your shoe that's always there. And you notice it when you're young, but you just get caught up in just life and growing up and your career. And then later on, those pebbles get bigger, there's more pebbles, and you just can't stop looking at that foot then, right? You're like, it's just really uncomfortable walking, noticing it. what role did climate play in accepting your role? It sounded like it affected you and growing up, but this role that you have at Carbon Direct.
Yeah, it did play a big role. I had always assumed, falsely, very wrongly, that to work in climate or environmental space in general, you had to kind of be at an NGO or a not necessarily, it could be a for-profit company, but not a company that was going to be big and important and meaningful. So I'd never taken it too seriously. And in fact, when I was in law school, I thought about being an environmental lawyer. There's no good money in it, and I had lots of debt, and so I just sort of like turned the other way. But when I started talking to John at Carbon Direct, I recognized just the magnitude of the global problem and also the economic risk that we are facing everywhere, and huge shifts in human population centers, and large scale weather events that create tens of billions, potentially trillions of dollars of damage every year. And as I started to dig into some of the economics of it, I realized this is something the planet just has to tackle. There's no option anymore. And when you have to do something, it creates economic opportunity. And I found that pretty interesting. Like, this is a point in our planet's history where you can work on environmental issues, you can work in climate, and you can make a lot of money. And those things are not mutually exclusive at all. And that drew me in. And so I started to dig in closer, more into Carbon Direct, but also into the carbon credits industry overall. It's super early days. There's not a lot of companies competing right now, but there will be. It's pretty clear to see where it's going. And that excited me. I had a great job at booking.com. Was in no hurry to leave, but to end up at a spot where I really felt like I had economic upside and was working on climate, it just seemed like I couldn't pass it up.
Yeah, that's great. You're kind of already talking to our thesis of this whole season. We really wanted to talk to companies that are doing this for profit for a number of reasons, but really to ask that, one of them was to ask that question you kind of asked, like, is this just government work or NGO work or nonprofit work, or is there economic opportunity here? So really cool.
Excellent. Well, let's get into that now. Before we jump into Carbon Direct and carbon management, maybe we'll go over some terminology for the audience, give them some foundation. So let's just start with, there's a carbon removal credits versus carbon offsets versus renewable energy credits, which is RECs. Like, are these all the same? How are these different? Maybe we'll just start with carbon credits.
Yeah, carbon credits, carbon offsets, I think, are fairly interchangeable terms. Okay. Offsets has a more negative connotation, but similar concept. It's a broad term too, and RECs are in this as well. These credits are essentially allowing you to pay to not emit or pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then claim a benefit or a credit for doing that. So if if my entire annual emissions associated with myself as an individual is 1 ton of CO2, I could either stop moving, breathing, and eating and not emit any CO2, or I could purchase a carbon removal credit. We can talk about what that means in a second, to essentially make it as if I did not move, eat, or emit. But if I did choose to not move or emit at all or eat anything, I could also potentially sell that to somebody and say, like, hey, I didn't move or eat for the last year. To the extent that I'm still alive, you can claim a benefit on my behalf, essentially, and then you can then emit more. So that's, I don't know why I went down the using myself as the example, but that's kind of the idea. It's either one person stops emitting what they would otherwise emit and then sells that as a credit, or you can, there's technologies but also things like planting trees where you can sequester CO2 and sell that as a removal benefit.
Okay. And how is this different than a renewable energy credit?
Same idea with a REC of renewable energy credit, of just you're moving to renewable energy and off of fossil fuels. So by making that transition, you're emitting less CO2. And then you can sell that delta to somebody.
Okay. So to simplify it, a REC is just like a carbon credit, but it's the source of that energy was done through renewable energy, like solar.
Yeah.
Perhaps. Yeah.
That's my understanding. To be honest, I know nothing about RECs.
Okay.
But yep.
And then negative emissions. We heard this a lot on Climate Journey podcast with John Goldberg, a couple of different places. What exactly are negative emissions the same thing as a carbon credit? Is it more of like an umbrella term for that?
It depends on how you use that term, but a negative, like let's use Microsoft as an example, a really leading organization. They are going to go to net zero as a first step, which means that for all of their activities, all their emissions, they're either going to reduce, so moving data centers to renewable energy, carbon-free energy as an example. To the extent that they can't reduce, like their employee travel on jets, they're going to purchase carbon removals credits. And they're actually going to purchase more than they need to get to the point where they're operating in a negative state to make up for all of their historical emissions, as if they never emitted anything. Pretty astounding goal. Most companies aren't that aggressive. So negative emissions could be used in that sense of I'm purchasing carbon removal to actually get me to be on the whole operating in a negative state, pulling more CO2 out of the atmosphere than I'm emitting myself. It could also be used in a general sense of negative emissions are these carbon removal credits. And we didn't talk about that, but carbon removal is really not different than a carbon offset. It's part of the broader bucket, but it's a specific kind of offset that is actually pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. And if you think about offsets broadly, there's the avoided emissions, which I talked about. So there's also avoided deforestation, right? Like I'm not avoiding emissions, but I'm avoiding cutting down trees that otherwise would hold carbon. But there's also things that are where you're being active and pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. So I'm planting a bunch of trees in an area that has not had a forest for the last X number of years, call it the last 50 years. I'm planting those trees. They would not have otherwise existed. And I'm going to sell that as carbon removal credits. That's really helpful because those trees are going to suck up a lot of carbon from the atmosphere and store it for a reasonably long period of time. There's also engineered carbon removal, which is fascinating in and of itself. But building plants with giant fans to suck in air and then using chemical compounds to capture the CO2 and then store it underground, often in old oil wells, or taking rocks and having them CO2 attached to those rocks and then dumping them off in the desert somewhere or whatever. So these are really interesting, not new technologies. The technology has been around for a long time, but people are now taking these technologies and scaling them and creating all kinds of different ways to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Fascinating. Okay. What is carbon management?
Carbon management is also a general term. We may have even made it up, but it's essentially the process of understanding what your CO2 emissions are and taking steps to mitigate, reduce, remove CO2 that you are emitting. So it starts with just the basic understanding of your operations today. How
Just
much
measuring. Yeah.
Yeah. It often starts with that. Now, it doesn't have to start with that. And I think that's a misconception that you have to understand your footprint. One of my PMs, I love that she says this, but she always says, I don't need to know how much water I'm using to know that I should use less water. I think, same thing with CO2. Often people get hung up on the measurement side. Well, how could I offset or how could I reduce if I have no idea what I'm emitting today? That's not really fair, but it's generally the first step that organizations go through is the measurement side. And then you start to go into the two core pathways of reducing, and that's by transitioning to less carbon intensive energy sources, reducing your activities in certain ways, and then purchasing high quality carbon credits that actually have meaningful impact on the atmosphere.
Okay.
So
excellent.
I'm gonna jump in there because I love that you said you think that you guys may have invented this term. I mean, I know you weren't necessarily there right at the beginning, but is this in essence what Carbon Direct does? like this idea of carbon management, what you just kind of described, or is this how it started? Maybe that's a better way to ask the question.
Yeah, that's what Carbon Direct does. We help companies manage their CO2 emissions and find credible, defensible, and economically viable pathways to reduce and remove. That's the core of what we do. And I'm tongue in cheek on us inventing it. I have no idea who invented it. I don't think we did,
Right.
but certainly it's not an established term. We are, as an industry, kind of developing it together. But it's going to be an incredibly important part of every company's path forward.
And yeah, how I frame in my head is there's wealth management. People have put their money with a wealth management firm, and then they maximize it, optimize it. And you do the same thing with your carbon. Like, how do you really?
Yeah,
And you're just trying to
interesting.
reduce it. That's the most simple way to understand it. And then I guess last thing on definitions. So there's two categories for carbon capture. There's natural and then engineering based. Can you explain each of those really quickly, or maybe an example in each one?
Yeah, I touched on it really
Yeah.
quickly there, but natural is really um, using natural things that exist in the environment, like trees, plants, soil, and optimizing them to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. So the example I used of planting trees is an obvious one. There's also different ways to till soil and ensure that there's right nutrient blends in soil so that it's optimized for capturing carbon. That type of work. Peat moss, huge source of um, carbon sequestration.
Oh,
So
really?
different things like that.
Hmm.
Anything that's biological, I guess, in nature. And then engineered is human invented.
Okay.
So it could be the rocks that I was talking about. Rocks obviously are natural, but humans invented the chemicals and processes to turn those into rocks
Interesting.
that capture
Yeah.
CO2. Direct air capture is another example. And there's certain hybrid solutions, like you can take wood and burn it in a very specific way to basically condense it and capture carbon, and then you can bury it underground. Biochar is what it's called. So yeah, there's lots of different ways to do it.
Very
Yeah.
interesting. Okay.
So I know you weren't there at the beginning, but what do you know of the founding story? I love the fact that we kind of mentioned wealth management, as well as kind of these scientific methods, because the two founders are basically that, right? It was a wealth manager and a scientist that kind of got together to start this company, correct?
Well, I think John was definitely the founder. He's a hedge fund manager, did commodities trading, and then Julio Friedman and Jen Wilcox were also both there very early, longtime scientists in the space. Jen
Oh,
Wilcox joined the Biden administration and does a lot of work for the Department of Energy around carbon capture and sequestration. Julio's on staff at Carbon Direct now. He was a professor at Columbia prior to that. Jen was a professor at Penn. And Julio's been around this business as long as anybody can be around it. He's been working in carbon capture, I think, for most of his career. So very,
wow.
very seasoned people who started the firm. And it really kind of had one goal, which was to scale carbon management. I mean, it's as simple as that, but there's obviously a lot of detail packed into that. On the supply side, emerging technologies, both in the nature-based and engineered, need capital, need to scale, and really, really quickly. We need to get to 10 gigatons of CO2 removal for most IPCC pathways. We're in the arguably millions of tons right now. You're talking about 10 billion
Wow.
every single year. Huge scale problem. So deploying capital to those businesses on the supply side and also giving them the support to grow their businesses and find buyers, that's really, really important. And then on the demand side, helping to grease the wheels and create more demand. And then when that demand exists for carbon removal, making sure that the purchases are done in a credible, defensible way, the credits are high quality, all of that work on the demand side. So Carbon Direct started focused on that. We've since evolved a little bit more, and we do more than just carbon credit work. We also help with reduction pathways. We do a little bit of policy work for clients at times, so we're doing more and more to just help our clients with whatever they need. But it started kind of focused on the supply and demand side of carbon removal.
Yeah, so super interesting. So again, forgive my simplification here, but it seems like on one side, that demand side, talking to companies, helping them manage, or hit the goals that they were kind of thinking about for themselves by finding them good, high quality credits and the place to go. And then the other side, you guys actually raised a fund, right, and actually invest in growth companies that are in this space, whether they be natural or engineering, right?
Yeah, that's right. And fund is going well. Found some really great companies to invest in and grow, as you can imagine, for regulatory reasons and also just because we think it's the right thing to do. We operate very separately from that
Got it.
fund, so
Yeah.
we represent our clients and whatever help they need. We're not pushing companies that we've invested in or anything like that. But both of those are really, really important. And the fund is doing great work. So yeah.
Yeah. Super interesting. And then it sounds like you've started to grow kind of your service offerings, and I'm assuming product offerings. You're the chief product officer here, so talk a little bit more about the policy initiatives, the other initiatives you just kind of highlighted.
I think the main growth areas are really building out the software side. So we have a SaaS tool where you can manage your carbon. I'll talk more about that in a second, and making the carbon removal bit a lot more approachable. That's been an important change for us. So like when we first started, it really was the Microsofts, the Shopifys, those were early clients. There's others that I can't share the names of, but very sophisticated, large organizations with sustainability teams who had specific questions on carbon removal. They'd already made a commitment, some sort of climate commitment. They wanted to work with Carbon Direct to execute on it. Sometimes it was on contracting, reviewing specific projects from a scientific lens. We did a lot of that work. It was quite bespoke and also very, very serious, I would say. Not approachable to the standard run of the mill, like I'm a program manager in an organization. I don't know if we have a climate commitment, or to the extent we do, it's kind of loose. I want to help define that and I want to start acting. Help me. We weren't great for that. Now we're really good at that. So we've evolved our team to help all different types of organizations. We've evolved our software to do that as well. I think that's been a big shift for us. So it's not just Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies that can get access to this incredible kind of science team and also commercial team that has been working in this space for a long time. On the software side, all of this needs to scale, right? I was talking about the carbon removal suppliers themselves scaling. Carbon management also needs to scale. If you want to scale by finding an expert who can hold your hand through the whole thing, you're going to be challenged because there's not that many out there. So we think software is a really important pathway for carbon management to become embedded in every organization. And we're building tools to do that. The first few tools we built, one is specific to carbon removal. So we capture data and information from carbon removal developers and suppliers, make that really accessible to potential buyers. And we also have a platform where you can review projects and make purchases. So that's exciting. And then we have what we call carbon footprinting tool. So you send us data about your business operations, we ingest it, evaluate it, and give you reports and guidance on how to reduce, and also guide you on how to remove. So you can kind of start to see the full package coming together. That reductions piece is going to be an area that grows a lot in every organization over time. Like how many options do you have as a company to reduce? I can't send my employees on carbon neutral flights unless I have a lot of purchasing power. I can't change my my utility company's way of operating. So we try and help with that, but there's a lot that we can do with supply chain and with creating incentive structures for downstream providers to your organization to change. That's where I think the most growth will come. But for now, focusing on getting the footprint right, doing the removals, and just understanding the pathways is critical.
So does this go back to kind of that management or measurement conversation we were having a second ago, which was your tool will ingest what a company is kind of how they operate, what their major functions are, and you will kind of give back a measurement or a number or maybe some ideas of where goals to hit, something like that?
Yep, we'll do that. We do it in a very robust way. I think it's quite defensible and auditable. Not everybody is doing it with kind of the level of depth that we are. But that's not important for everybody, but we do think it's important long term if you think that your emissions are, well, let me give you a very clear example. We did our own emissions across our tool and several other companies' tools. Ours showed about 2.5x what anybody else's tool showed in terms of emissions. And the primary reason for us, without getting like the total number specifically, was contrails from airplanes actually have a pretty significant warming effect. And so if you're flying a lot, those contrails matter. And this is...
What are contrails?
Contrails is the vapor. When you look up in a plane, you see the white lines behind. It's the vapor that comes off the end of the wings. Now, I'm the wrong person to ask in terms of the exact climate impact they have, but it is very, very significant. It's very established. This isn't a point of debate. But that's the type of stuff that the typical tool that's just looking at how much fuel was burned in a flight and applying emissions to that, they're not considering the actual effects of that flight itself. And this is getting into some deeper measurement and scientific stuff. Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that we're really focused on, because you don't want to go out and say, my emissions are 2,000 a year at my organization. And then 3 years later, when the science gets stronger and people start to accept these things that have been known for a while, like contrails, it's like, well, actually 3 years ago, it wasn't 2,000, it was 6,000 or 7,000 because you weren't accounting appropriately. That's not a good state to be in. So we're trying to be conservative and make the right choices now, even if it's a bit more painful, so that it's super, super defensible long term. Yeah,
super interesting evolution. And it sounds like your new product set, your SaaS model is giving you, I'm guessing, more access to more customers. So you talked a little bit about these kind of bigger companies that are willing to invest in this, the Microsofts, the Spotifys of the world. But what about everybody else? Is it this SaaS product that we need so that we can know where our effect is? What is the appetite right now from a business perspective to start to pay for this, to start to get into this? What are you guys learning about that?
I think, we have a very long view, and it's super clear that every organization is going to have to do some form of carbon management and remove their emissions. And there's lots of reasons for it. There's regulatory pressure that's continuing to mount. There's also regulatory incentives. So the IRA has suddenly made a lot of fuel pathways cheaper, carbon capture is cheaper. Consumer pressure, it's not grown as significantly as one might think. And I don't want to overplay this one, because consumers say they care a lot about climate, but they're not really acting that way yet. That said, generational shifts are happening. People under 30 especially care a lot about this. We're going to these recruiting conferences, and it's just overwhelming the number of young people out of university that want to work in climate. It's not because they think it's the biggest economic opportunity for them, although it probably is, frankly. It's because they care about it, and they're pushing the brands that they work with, companies they work with, to do that. But pushing aside the consumer thing entirely, if you can imagine a world where there's some form of regulation on oil companies or even only Fortune 100 companies to reduce their carbon emissions, which hard to imagine a world where that doesn't exist. Every downstream provider to that company has to get in line too, because if you're dependent on partners and vendors, and they don't reduce their emissions, then you're not reducing yours. And so those vendors are hearing, okay, well, if I want to keep working with Facebook or Microsoft, who's made this claim, I need to start acting. And then their competitors are saying, well, if I ever want to get a shot at that contract in the future, I better start acting. So there's all of these knock-on effects from organizational commitments like Microsoft's, or regulatory pressure, like you're seeing with SEC climate disclosures potentially being passed in Europe, similar things, Japan. So every business is going to have to start paying attention to this. And once your competitors start moving their trajectories downward, you're going to want to do the same. It's a pretty clear theory of change. I don't know how quickly it will happen, but it will happen.
So who's your sweet spot customer today?
Two different sweet spot customers. One is a more sophisticated organization that wants access to the deep scientific expertise we have. We've got over 30 really leading scientists in their fields who understand all the carbon reduction removal pathways, and are doing interesting, incredible work in those areas. Getting access to them is valuable. People pay for that. So that's one bucket. The other is it can kind of range in terms of where they're at in their journey, but it's a company that's serious about doing something related to their mission. So we don't get a ton of prospects or leads that fit this profile, but even if we did, we wouldn't work with them. The ones who just want to like get a measurement and say they worked with Carbon Direct and then, tell their employees that they're doing something about it, but don't actually act, really uninteresting to us. We don't want to work with them. But if you're serious, if you say, you know what, this is a real problem, I have made a goal, some sort of climate goal, or I want to make a goal, and I want to start making progress towards it. It doesn't matter if you're an enormous Fortune 100 company or, a small family office. We want to help you with that, and we have really good tools to help you with that, depending on kind of what your needs are. So I think an interesting thing, Ty, I know you've worked with a lot of software companies. We have a consulting practice, which actually it's probably not the best way to put it. It's not really a true consulting, but we have access to science teams, and you pay. It's not like an hourly or model like that, but you can pay to get access to really deep expertise in things that you care about. So for large organizations, sometimes it's pretty valuable. I used to think of that as a little bit of a limitation on the software side. It's actually incredible because you can onboard with the software. We're going to give you some recommendations. Some of those you're like, yep, got it. I can do this, or at least I know how to do it, whether I do it or not. Other ones you're like, they're suggesting I purchase carbon removal in these forms. I don't know what that means. I need to understand it better. I need to defend it to my board. How do I do that? Instead of sending you like a FAQ doc, you can actually just get on the phone with, if we're talking about a biochar project, with the leading biochar scientists in the world, right? Wow. And I think that's a really cool lever that we have, and trying to lean into it more.
Yeah, I'm glad you kind of brought that up, because that's what I was kind of seeing, outside of the fund itself, which I still think is super intriguing. This idea of the services that the scientists provide, and now your software SaaS product, how do they play together, and more appropriately, where's it going? You said at the beginning that the mission was kind of increase carbon management, make it accessible to a lot more companies. So as you look forward, and you look at this roadmap as the product guy, where do you see this going? Where are you guys aiming next?
Yeah, it's end-to-end management. So we're going to get a lot better at the measurement side and more specific. Ultimately, though, all that we care about is action, and action comes in two forms. Primarily, it's reducing or removing. And I know I've said that 17 times, and I'll say it 50 more times, but that's what really makes a difference for the climate. That's what it's all about. So we're going to get much better at the right recommendations at the right time, and also helping you understand cost curves and pathways to reduce. I'll give you an example that I was just working on the last couple of weeks with sustainable aviation fuels. Sustainable aviation fuels, there's like 23 different types, but it's essentially lower carbon intensity fuels relative to Jet A, which is the primary jet fuel used today. And they used to be very expensive. They still are very expensive, and there's not a lot of supply, but we're going to need a lot more supply. So if I'm an airline, it's an obvious thing, like I should probably figure out SAF. But also if I'm a large organization and big chunk of my emissions come from airline travel, I might be thinking about, could I secure supply for SAF for my private planes? Maybe I could push my contract with Delta to start using SAF on certain flights that I travel on a lot. That's really expensive right now to secure SAF that's going to be available in 5 years or 10 years. But with the cost curves changing, it could become cheaper. And frankly, the IRA, some of these fuels are going to be cheaper than Jet A. So what if I invest in that now? versus investing in carbon removal credits to offset some of the travel that I'm doing, versus investing in a new train line between my two offices in California. I'm just making things up, but like these are choices that are really hard to make. Like, what is $1 spent on SAF today versus $1 spent on carbon removal versus $1 spent on a wreck versus $1 spent on lower carbon intense concrete for the next building that I put up. So we're trying to get really good at giving that guidance so that it's high ROI, high carbon benefit ROI for every dollar spent.
And this would be through the SaaS dashboard that companies are buying into, right?
So the way that we approach it, yes, the way that we approach it is science is tip of the spear, figure out the right pathways, figure out the right approach. Julio Friedman, who you mentioned earlier, one of the early / founders of Carbon Direct, invented this thing called the levelized cost of carbon abatement. And it's essentially what I was just talking about. Where do you get the best carbon ROI? Yeah. That's still very bespoke and very hard to do. So there's researchers that spend time on it. As we learn those things, though, it's getting embedded into the product. So some of those things are already, in our product today. But, if you're buying carbon management software right now from anybody, and we have some really great competitors or frenemies or whatever you want to call them. There's other great organizations doing this. None of it is awesome yet. It's very far from awesome.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really matter if it's good right now. It would be great if it was, but what matters is where it's going to be in the next 2 years, the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, as you're trying to hit that 2030 goal or 2040 goal. And from that, on that time horizon, our software is going to be very, very good. And the customers who are working with us now understand that and are investing in that process with us.
So with these two sides, science as the point of the spear, the SaaS product that makes it a little bit more accessible. How are you guys making money today? Like, when you go into a new company, what is the typical structure, and what do they pay for first?
It really depends on where they're at. Some are very software first. We want something that's really approachable, easy to onboard quickly. We don't need a whole lot of depth. Others are paying us very, very large contracts to spend a lot of time investigating specific parts of their operation. So it kind of depends. I think, the clear shift, though, is away from bespoke and more as things become more normalized in the industry and the expectations are standardized, more towards something that you can embed and be part of your long-term organizational planning. So we're seeing that shift start to happen, especially with things like measurement, footprinting, but even with things like understanding carbon removal, there's a period where every single purchase was highly scrutinized and a huge amount of research went into it. Now people are kind of saying, well, I don't want to do all that research. I don't want to run an RFP. Kind of just want to have it packaged and purchased. So this stuff, as it becomes normalized, becomes easier to do with software.
So this kind of leads into kind of the thesis that we talked about a little bit earlier of people making money in this business. And that's kind of our whole thesis this year of talking to for-profit companies that are going after this. It seems like carbon capture is a bit of a technology, or carbon management, excuse me. There's a bit of a technology piece of it. We need new companies. We need all these different ideas of natural versus engineered, et cetera. Then there's what you guys have done, which you're kind of playing you've got a fund, you've got I know we don't use the word consultancy, but you've got your point of the spear and the scientists that are doing really heavy lifting, bespoke, contracts, and then this SaaS technology platform. You guys have seemed to find a way to make money in the middle of this big thing. Why is that an important way to build this type of business and go out and tackle this big problem?
Why is it important to make money? Or
sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in for-profit companies for change. We've seen the Patagonia example. It's a little bit beaten to a pulp at this point, but Yvon Chouinard has been an inspiration for me, and I think just shows the power of brand. And it's a consumer company, but brand that you can build on values that you care about. There's a lot of other people that care about those values, and for us, for-profit matters because frankly, the value in a capitalist society is making money. And we're not going to change that in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 2050, 2100. Like it's going to be hard to see that shift happen. So let's accept that people want to make money, companies want to make money, and figure out ways to make that choice to be also good, operating in a way that's positive for the environment easier. So that's a lot of what we're spending time on, is making it so those choices aren't as difficult. Now, I don't want to make it seem like you don't have to make sacrifice. You do, but it's sacrifice in a way that will help your business long term. If I'm starting to decarbonize now, I'm going to be in a much better competitive position in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I will be better off than my direct competition. I also may be the only one who's able to apply for, you know, an RFP with a Microsoft who has a net zero goal. And there's going to be a lot more of those companies over the next few years. We're already seeing exponential growth in net zero commitments. So I care about it for competitive advantage. I care about it because I want to avoid regulatory risk. What if an administration comes along in 8 years or whatever that has very strong views on climate, and they start to pass pretty progressive legislation in the U.S. There's already a threat of it in Europe. You know, I view that personally as a very positive thing for the world. As an organization, that could be quite scary. How do I get in front of that?
Right.
There's investors, activist investors. I mean, we saw it happen at Exxon, but you know, we're really pushing organizations to change their practices. And then, of course, consumer sentiment. So there's a million different things that are leading you to behave in a less carbon intensive way from a purely business perspective. And by the way, it's just it's the right thing to do. I mean, it's not, this is not a hard choice.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
It's interesting you put it like that. So we're talking about capitalism, in a capitalist society, making money matters, and then you're kind of projecting out into the future. So if I'm a company, I'm thinking, okay, well, things are going to get worse, right? We're going to get more natural disasters. It's going to become more apparent that climate change is happening. And I've always said before that if you're able to predict the future, you can be rich, you can become rich, right? But predicting the future is hard. But there's really nice indicators, or not nice, but clear indicators that we're getting that this has become a bigger and bigger part of our lives. So I guess switching gears a little bit, what is the scaling plan for Carbon Direct? Since it's a relatively young company, it's only 3 years old. You get started with something more consulting based. You're leaning into the software side of things. How do you go from, removing 500 million tons of carbon per year through your clients, for your clients, and with them, to that scale that's needed, right? The 40 billion tons per year, and so on.
yeah, I mean, just we're nowhere close to 500 million tons today, just to be clear. Not that I'm trying to fact check you, but like it's very small right now. In the millions, arguably, you could maybe argue tens of millions per year. And then we need to get to 10 billion per year just on carbon removal. And you're right that 40 billion is the amount global emissions per year. So we also need to reduce by about 35, 40 billion tons per year. So there's a lot that needs to happen pretty quickly here. Our scaling plan, certainly, we're going to continue to invest in our existing business lines, bringing on the world's leading scientists, making sure we nurture them, and grow their influence. We'll continue to invest in software. I think there's a lot that we can do in the US still, but also Europe is quite progressive. So it'd be interesting to start playing there. And we're also frankly exploring, work in other economies that people pay less attention to, like in the Middle East and parts of Asia. I think that's all really important. The biggest thing that we can do, though, frankly, is kind of play our cards carefully and ride this out, because there will be sea changes. But we're going into a period of economic uncertainty, almost certainly economic turmoil to an extent. I hope that carbon management isn't what's cut from every organization's budget. And to be clear, we're not seeing that at all. We're getting more lean in than lean out, which is exciting. But that could happen. We need to be very clear that this is a multi-decadal problem. It's not by 2024 we need to fix things. So we're trying to be very careful, think about the long term, make choices for the long term, guide our clients on the long term, and run our business for the long term. And if we can do that and keep providing value, then scaling is going to happen sort of auto-magically. I don't mean to make it simple, but like I went through this with marketing technology where we had a nothing business and then very quickly had a very, very significant business because the industry evolved at the right time and we were in the right place to capture it.
Are you guys, real quick, are you guys just in the US or are you in other countries?
We have an office in London, and clients are all over the world. We service plenty of clients in South America, Asia, Europe, Middle East, and projects also. Carbon removal projects are all over the world. So it's a pretty international business. I would say most of the dollars being spent right now are from U.S. companies. I think U.S. in general is quite innovative and forward-looking and first movers in many ways, but it's happening everywhere.
Nice.
In the future, are y'all going to be just B2B like you are now, or do you imagine it being as much B2C as B2B?
Hard for me to imagine a B2C. I think there's going to be other companies that do that better than we do. Never say never, I guess, but I like the idea of servicing organizations and then letting those organizations serve their customers. So if they're a B2C company, we make sure that everything on the back end is T's are crossed, I's are dotted, and that they can make credible claims to their customers.
Yeah. And I guess with B2B, the biggest dents can be made, biggest chunks of impact can be made that way versus individuals. And individuals can do their own things. They can be a vegetarian, use different forms of transportation. They can be planting trees, like they can get solar, which there's all things in motion with the climate bill that's going to make that easier. But it sounds like you all believe that the B2B route is the best way to get closer to that 1.3 trillion that's already in the atmosphere, of removing that, and then the 40 billion carbon that is every year. Is that right?
I think that's the companies are acting more than individuals are right now. If everybody on the planet started to care about climate change and were willing to make some sacrifices, that would be a much bigger shift than what we're seeing from businesses. I just think realistically that's not going to happen. But organizations, face different pressures from different sets of actors and seem to be more willing to change right now.
Yeah, I could see that.
So I'm going to jump ahead a couple. Well, yeah, I've been thinking about this. I want to explore just a tiny bit this idea of the fund side of your business, meaning where you invest in other companies. And I don't know if this is a way to answer this question, but what if someone else wants to get into the earth saving business? They want to go into this space, and you guys might be looking. I believe the thesis of the fund is a growth stage investment, so you're not necessarily early stage, startup stage. But if you, with what you know today, and someone wanted to get into this earth saving business and wanted to build a startup or start to go in this path, what do you think? Where do you think they should head? What are some pitfalls maybe generally they should look out for? And what's some, tips or tricks that might get them there a little bit quicker from what you know now?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I don't work on the fund side, so I'm not going to speak to it from the Carbon Direct perspective, but working with a lot of entrepreneurs in this space, I think exactly as we were just discussing, building a for-profit organization is a better way to get VC funding than building a nonprofit, obviously. But to do that well, a couple of really important things need to happen. One is whatever you're doing, it needs to be defensible and credible from a scientific perspective. This all needs to attach to real climate impact. The intermediaries, the ones who are selling bunk offsets, like that stuff is all going to fail if you can't defend it. So, so start with something solid and robust, and then make it economically viable. So, there's a lot of great technology that has real climate impact, and from an equivalency perspective, it's like $5,000 per ton of carbon. If you can't figure out how to get that cost curve down to something more manageable, and manageable in this case is certainly below $100 a ton, probably below $50 a ton, don't bother. I mean, I'm not saying that that's a wasted effort because we learn a lot through new technology deployments, even if the cost doesn't come down. But if you want to build a scalable long-term business, it has to be viable. And most projections for cost of carbon are well below, certainly below $200 a ton, often below $100 a ton, somewhere around $50 a ton. So that's kind of your target.
Wow.
And things aren't that cheap right now, but they need to become that cheap.
Yeah, yeah, super good advice, and I, digging into what you guys do and the people you work with on both sides, the supply and demand side of the business, really, it sparked my entrepreneurial, antennae of like, man, there's opportunity here. There's some technology that is going to help, but yes, there is this big problem of scale of getting it to economically feasible state. So yeah, that's super good advice there. The other side of this is the governments, right? Like I feel like over the last couple of years, carbon capture, especially, has started to become part of all worldwide governments have started talking about carbon capture. Doesn't necessarily seem to align with that they know exactly what carbon capture means or how to get it done. But I mean, I've listened to some talks that we still feels like we need government involved in. I think you said it earlier, where it would be powerful if the government got in, if nothing else, to kind of create more regulations, create some goals, create some price stability in the markets, these types of things. What do you see as the biggest thing that we could see from the governments today, or what we need from them, from Carbon Directs or your guys' perspective?
I mean, the dream answer to this is a carbon tax or kind of global price on
Got it.
carbon, right? Because then everybody can orient around that. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. That's a carbon tax is the stick version. There's also the carrot version, which is what the IRA is. And I'm not going to claim to be an IRA expert, but it essentially makes fuel generation a lot cheaper, alternative fuel generation a lot cheaper. So hydrogen, ammonia, these types of things. And then it makes carbon capture cheaper. It creates a lot of incentive programs to capture and store carbon. Really significant change. And when I talked about those prices earlier of getting to $150 a ton, the IRA is doing that for some technologies. And I even mentioned, sustainable aviation fuel as an example. All of those were completely out of bounds of what people would normally pay for jet fuel. With the IRA incentives, several of those fuel pathways are the same cost, and some of them are even below cost. Some of them are even negative
Wow.
cost. In theory,
Wow.
you could almost get paid to create them. So
Wow.
so that's really different state of the world now post IRA. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not an expert in the IRA itself, but I think in general, like government can be thoughtful about where can we find agreement on things that help many parts of our economy and also help with climate. And the IRA is a great example of this. The Joe Manchin holdout vote, while frustrating for some people, it did get the bill to a point where there's a lot of benefit for all different types of all contingencies of people. And frankly, like coal miners benefiting from climate action, I don't have any issue with that. Those people are going to need jobs in this future economy too, and so he's looking out for that set of his constituents. Storing carbon underground can be controversial because a lot of that carbon is stored in old oil wells. Oil wells are owned by oil companies to a large degree. So there's economic upside for those oil companies to do carbon capture and storage. Great. Again, as long as it comes to climate benefit, for me, I'm okay with it. That may not be the way that everybody thinks, but I think government can find ways to identify middle ground opportunities that are good for climate and good for business.
I love that perspective. That's powerful perspective to even that holdout vote, which I love that you called out. So with everything that you've kind of seen, now that you're in this space, and I think Carbon Direct is in this unique position where, again, they're working with, you guys are building technology, you're working with suppliers, or demand, and you've got you're seeing these new upstarts, these new companies coming in. now sitting in the seat that you have with the vision that you have, looking forward to the future a bit, what do you think might be the next big step change in climate action or climate sustainability?
Oh, great question. I mean, there's one kind of narrow topic, which is call it MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, or measurement, reporting, and verification. And this is important for carbon credits themselves. If we can develop MRV standards, it makes it easier for us to know when a credit is a credit, when a ton is a ton.
Wow.
That's not easy today. And with new technologies developing all the time, it's becoming harder and harder to do. But right now, when I buy a forestry credit, there's satellite imagery I can look at. I can see sort of what the baseline of that forest was before and what the carbon project itself generated and what that delta is. And I can have a reasonably good sense of the credits generated by a specific project, maybe discounted because there's some uncertainty. When I get into soils, it's a lot harder because you have to go to specific, you have to take soil samples and analyze them. Soil in one location could be very different from soil 3 feet from it. So it's harder to do the verification there. And then you get into stuff like, ocean alkalinity, where you're essentially changing the chemical makeup of the ocean to sequester more carbon, really freaking hard to measure and verify. And things like direct air capture are a lot easier in a lot of ways, but like, what is the standard? What are the tools that everybody is using so that we're looking at them on a like for like basis? All of that is brand new. So that's a big opportunity in the credit space. In the reduction space, I think it comes down to what I was talking about earlier. Every company needs to embed carbon management, and I need to make it part of my procurement process. So I want to know if I'm selecting you, not just what your monthly price is or whatever, but how many tons of CO2 do I have to attribute to working with you? That should just be part of everything. It will be part of everything. But the sooner that happens, the sooner we're able to get the measurement in place and make changes. That'd be a big sea change.
Yeah, tie it to that buying decision. That's brilliant. I like that. I like that a lot. All right, Jacob. I think it's time.
I think it's time. All right, Dana, we do something called Rapid Mayhem questions at the end of every show. So, first question is: are you ready?
I'm scared.
Are you ready?
I don't think I'm ready for this, but
okay,
yeah, let's do it.
Don't be scared. Don't be scared. You got it.
All right, it's gonna be around decarbonization, carbon markets, stuff like that. All right, so they're all true or false. True or false? 39% of all CO2 has been released just in the past 25 years.
Honestly, that feels low to me. There's been quite rapid growth over the last 25, 50 years. I don't know, 39%, that could be right. I would guess more like 60% or 70%.
Okay. You're right. It's about 50%. 50%.
Okay.
And
false. Nice job.
False. Nice
job.
Next up.
He does these little trick questions where it's like the statement
I just tweak it a
true,
little bit.
And then he tweaks it. Yeah, you got to watch out for him.
Yeah.
There's about 1.6 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere already.
True or false? That is true, unless you have some trick. That's
no trick. No trick. Okay. Yep. That's
right on.
That's right. Number 3.
Which is, by the way, that's wild when you think about it. We're emitting 40 billion, but you think about how much is already there. That brings to bear the carbon removal opportunity. Sorry.
I'm glad you brought that up, because those first two questions tie into each other. Crazy fact that the weight of the carbon that is it just in the past 25 years is more than the total mass of everything ever built by humans and still standing on Earth. To give the audience some sense of how heavy that is, that's weighing within our atmosphere right now.
It's unbelievable.
It's pretty.
I mean, carbon feels like, oh, it's gas, it's ethereal, but like it is a real thing. It can be physical, it can be solid. People don't always grasp that.
Interesting. I love it.
Now, for the products that can be made with or using carbon, some major products that can be upcycled are polymers, carbonized drinks, and even concrete. True or false?
I don't know if concrete can be made with CO2, but it can be strengthened with CO2, and you can inject CO2 into it. So, but maybe that's true. The other ones I think are true. The other ones you listed.
Okay. All right. So you picked true. It is true. CO2, I guess, can be substituted for water in curing concrete during the mixing, resulting in a similar mineralization, and then it results in actually the concrete being stronger.
Right. Yeah, no, that's
Yeah,
true.
yeah.
I don't know if it can
He said
replace
that. He said
concrete.
it can be
Yeah.
strong,
Yeah,
make it
it's
stronger.
true. It's
Yeah.
true. Yeah,
He nailed it.
he did. All right, last one. Carbon rocks through mineralization is a thing, and it costs $419 per ton.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier. Mineralization. So it's true or false whether it costs that much?
Yes.
Oof. I do not know the spot prices for carbon mineralization today. I'll say that feels a little low for today's prices from what I know. I only know a couple of companies doing that, but it doesn't really matter what the price is today. It will become a lot cheaper. It'll get down to $50 to $100 a ton for sure.
Oh, really? Because of new technologies?
Yeah. Wait, is that the price today though? That seems low to me.
So this is actually a reference from a podcast with Julio and John. And Julio mentioned it was $150 to $200. I don't know if that was hypothetical or theoretical. I'm referencing
Carbon
that.
mineralization today is 150 to 200.
Yeah, per ton.
Interesting. Well, I know there are companies where it's a lot more expensive. I also know it's going to get a lot cheaper. So
Right.
there might be some that
Yeah.
anyway. But yeah.
Yeah,
It's
maybe it
all
was
over
a
the place. Yeah.
general average or a
But you
median.
can buy it for $2,000 a ton right now, even.
Okay.
He still got it right. He still got it right.
Hey, still got right.
So
All right.
you did a great job. Got them all right.
Him
Thanks.
questions
I like it.
closed. We're
Nice.
done with those.
Nice job.
Wrapping up here. So Danan, climate change it's so big. Some people call it a hyper object. It's so hard to grasp. And people often feel helpless in helping. What's the equivalent of what a listener can do? Maybe think of what any busy soccer mom or young professional can do. What would you say?
Most of your listeners probably have jobs. Push your organization to figure out their carbon footprint is the first step. Just do that. It's so easy. Nice. It won't cost you that much, in the low tens of thousands of dollars and a couple of weeks of time from somebody on your team, and you can start planning from there. That would be huge. Anything that you do with your organization is probably going to be a much bigger impact than what you do individually. But of course, drive less. Next time you purchase a car, make it electric, fly less, eat less meat, all these things. But pressure your organization. And every single one of these robust sustainability programs at large organizations, even like Microsoft, they started with one person deciding that they care. They really did.
Wow.
And pushing their higher ups, pushing to do something. So be that person.
That's inspirational. I like that. It all started with one, but I also love this. This is a new one. They've all been new. I think we've got a great collection. We ask this question every single time. This is a great collection of what listeners can do. So really helps. That's a great one. All right, Danan, it was great. Where can we find you, man? I'm
inactive, but on Twitter at Danan Margason. Trying to be more active. I'm feeling that pressure right now, although maybe not the best timing to do it.
I think you have a great Twitter.
LinkedIn, and then thanks. Yeah, currently I talk about Bob Dylan. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, which is great, and I'm D Margason or Danan at carbondirect.com.
And yeah, where can we find Carbon Direct?
carbondirect.com. There's a dash in the middle. If you know who's sitting on carbondirect.com without the dash, please let me know. I'm trying to get in touch with them.
Trying to get in touch with that guy.
I might know a guy.
Yeah, or domain brokers, feel free to reach out. So
appreciate it. Well, this was a huge topic.
Yeah.
Big subject. I think it's got to be a big part of our solution. I think Carbon Direct is doing some amazing work, multi-pronged work, multi-year, multi-decade effort here that I think needs to happen. And we really thank you for taking some time and chatting with us and telling us about it today.
Awesome. Appreciate it. And thanks for caring.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much, Danan.
See ya.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Boom. How was that? Well, there's more. So keep listening. We speak with climate tech leaders and change makers in EV, reforestation, solar energy, flood mapping, and a whole lot more. Also, you can give feedback or check out show notes at our website, climatemayhem.com. Thanks for listening and see you next time.
Oh, don't forget, If you found this valuable or interesting at all, please hit subscribe. That way we know you're loving it. So just go to Spotify or whatever podcast app you're on, hit that subscribe button at the top. Production was done by Daniel Steenkamp with cover art by Harrison Glenn. This is Jacob Kubica with my legendary colleague, Ty Wolf motherfucking Jones. Peace out, Climate Mayhem. Out.